Welcome to Renegade Thinkers Unite, a show that will help you transform your marketing from mere messaging to programs that break the rules and make a difference. Join the movement today and learn non-traditional techniques that give you an edge. Now, here's your Chief Marketing Renegade, Drew Nizer.
One of my all-time favorite New Yorker cartoons is this one that features surgeons standing around, looking around a body, obviously concentrated around the head. They're actually brain surgeons. And as they're looking at the head and beginning an incision, one of them turns to the other and says, "Hey guys, this isn't advertising." And for you folks that are listening that are a little young, you may not remember the cliche that used to be in our business when I started in the business, which is, hey, this isn't brain surgery. But here's the reality in the 3 decades or so that I've been in this business. It's gotten a lot harder to be a successful marketer. It really has. And it takes, obviously I'm biased, but I think it takes a lot of renegade thinking. And it takes a leader in a position with the experience to know how to do this stuff and do it right and what levers to pull. So I'm really excited today to have you meet Peter Weingard, who is the CMO of New York Public Radio. Peter has a remarkable amount of experience in the media world, having worked at Clear Channel. And anyway, I'll get to some of that in one of my questions. But at New York Public Radio, which you may know as WNYC, he is responsible for innovation. He's responsible for marketing. I've got a long list. He's responsible for data, for research, all this good stuff. So we're going to be talking about how you start as a CMO. What are the first things that you do? How do you move the needle when you're a media property in a very challenging media world? And then we're going to talk about podcasts because those things have been killing it here at WNYC. So, Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
Peter, let's dive in. Tell us some of the things that you're working on right now that that are truly representative of some renegade thinking.
WNYC, or you said New York Public Radio, which I should describe, has quite a few brands and platforms under that umbrella. One of which is WQXR, which is a classical musical radio station here in New York. You may be, fun fact, it is the first FM broadcast station in the United States.
Whoa, that's pretty cool. How old is it?
I believe it's 92 years old, but don't quote me on that. The X in QXR was from its original call letters, and the X stood for experimental.
Wow.
Because FM was experimental.
Very cool.
Then, like you pointed out, WNYC. We also manage New Jersey Public Radio from here, and WNYC Studios, which is our content studio. You wrap all that up together, and you have actually what is the largest public radio station group in the United States and one of the biggest content producers in the country as well. So there's a lot of rich stuff in that stew, and as a marketer, I'm constantly looking across all these different properties, all the different consumers that we reach, and trying to figure out how best to optimize the experience for all the different touch points.
So you've got a portfolio of brands, which is one of the first challenges that CMOs face often in a situation. They come in and it's like, whoa, there are a lot of brands here. How did you sort of sort through them and figure out what your priorities were?
Financially speaking, the big priority is, of course, the terrestrial broadcast station. We are a member-driven organization, actually one of the largest membership organizations in New York City, with over 200,000 members, and that's how we pay our bills here. And so that becomes one of the priorities, of course. Across this portfolio of brands, too, you see there's lots of different objectives nestled within all the different brands. And some of the brands are quite large and quite important, like Radiolab, for example, and Freakonomics. Also, it's very important to think about how, unlike a lot of other companies, especially other media companies, because we are a mission-driven nonprofit, We are driven by the need to serve our mission and our consumers in a way. We're not looking at Wall Street and worrying about quarterly earnings reports and a lot of the other distractions that other media companies face. Well, lucky indeed, because I think it allows us to focus on what matters. And as a marketer, you always want to be focused almost relentlessly on the consumer. And here we get to do that because that really is why we're here.
The consumer is obviously your 200,000 members, but you have thousands more, millions more perhaps, that are actually listening to all of your programming.
Yeah, over 26 million people hear our programming on different platforms. So our customer base is actually quite a bit larger than the subset of customers who are members.
And that's an interesting fact just right there. You have 200,000 subscribers and 2.26 million listeners. So let's get a few more of those listeners to subscribe. But that's really hard, isn't it? People just sort of want content to be free.
There is that, and there's also the I would say sort of the two different worlds of the way people consume content. And this is, I think, true across all different content platforms, print, video, etc. That you have people who consume a linear experience, which is the more traditional, like broadcast television, broadcast radio, in which we're sort of curating the entire experience for you and you're listening, versus an on-demand experience like the podcasts. And if there were sort of two Venn diagrams representing both of those constituencies, there's some overlap. By and large, the on-demand audience is global for us because the broadcast radius is only so far. The radio stations are much more local, and hence there's different behaviors in both of those. However, there's common DNA across both the consumers and the content that we produce for both national or global on-demand distribution and terrestrial distribution. So we're seeing the emergence of new behaviors and new kinds of listening styles. Will it lend itself to a sort of a buying behavior the way we experience in terrestrial? I believe so, and I think we're already beginning to see that. You see that actually right now too with the New York Times, that subscription revenue is up. We just had a record pledge drive recently, and we're seeing increasing amounts of giving on the podcast portfolio. So I think people are willing to pay for quality content, and that's one of the areas where you're going to see big divergence in the worlds of media across all different types. There's so much media today. And if you had to ask me, you said, like, what are the sort of challenges in media? They've been the same, but ever so more accelerated, that the audience is fragmented and there's a plethora of content being created across professional and non-professional creators.
So a couple of things referencing back my interview with Meredith Kopit-Levien, who's just Meredith Kopit-Levien, and she talked about this the fact that there are really only 10 million people in the world that pay for content, which I thought feels so small, and so you guys in some ways are competing for that same base. Although I suspect people look at a donation to your property somehow different than they do paying for news.
It's all very different. And that's an excellent episode, and I would advise all your listeners to go back in the catalog and listen to it right now, and then come back. Because she said some really smart things, and us in the New York Times, I think, are fighting a very similar fight among, for journalism, for quality journalism. I think we have some differences, particularly around our coverage of local issues, which is an area where a lot of news organizations have pulled back their coverage. And that's something that is increasingly needed and people are willing to pay for. But the idea of quality, I think, is also somewhat universal. You'll see that people will pay to get HBO. And the vast difference in quality between an HBO show and what you might find on a run-of-the-mill cable network. The same principles apply with the work that we do. There's a lot of podcasts out there. There's a lot of audio experiences in the world. The latest data that I saw from Apple is there's 400,000 individual titles of shows in their catalog, and I think 10 billion individual episodes.
Yikes.
Right. But you'll have, obviously people are seeking out quality, because what we're really in the market fighting over is people's time and attention.
Yeah, that's all there is. That's all we have is that, and that's what all marketers, whether you're a media company or not, you're competing for share of mind. Really. And there's only 24 hours in a day. So that is the commodity that we're battling on. So I think what we'll do is we'll take a quick break, and that's a good place to do it. When we come back, I really want to focus on how do you as a brand or brands actually get more of the share of mind? Because that's what you're marketing, right? That's your marketing challenge. So we'll be right back.
Renegade Thinkers Unite is brought to you by Social Media Explorer, the website that explores the world of social media from the inside out. Great advice from today's leading social media columnists and experts at socialmediaexplorer.com. That's socialmediaexplorer.com.
Okay, we're back, and my guest is Peter Weingard, the CMO of New York Public Radio, home of a lot of different very cool properties, including Alec Baldwin's hit podcast, Here's the Thing. And what's interesting about this is, when I first moved to New York, I knew the local programming. In fact, I think it's Brian Lehrer who has a program. Brian and our kids played soccer together when they were like 4 years old. It's very funny. And anyway, I always thought of it as a radio station, essentially. And what you guys have really gone through, and I think this is the thing that you've been driving, is a digital transformation. And I think that's something that all brands sort of really need to be thinking about. Talk to me about how that went down here and during your term as CMO.
Yeah, a digital transformation is exactly the phrase. And when we take a little walk around here, I think what you'll notice is that you have even in the physical environment, a combination of a 93-year-old media institution and kind of a really scrappy startup. And you'll see elements of both the way people are working, the way the space looks, because we're building an entirely new business. And that includes developing entirely new business models for the way stuff is created. One of the things about the transformation that I think is really important is when we launched the studios, WNYC Studios, which is our content production house. Part of the rationale for that is that we're moving to creation of content that could live across distribution channels and platforms. So it's not designed to be broadcast on the radio and conform to the constraints of a broadcast clock and the FCC and all the rest. And that actually then starts the process of a lot of the shows that had traditionally been radio first, moving to digital first. So Radiolab, for example, produces first as a podcast, and then they adjust and edit it so that it could work on the radio.
That's very cool, by the way. That we're producing this first as a podcast. Who knows if Renegade Thinkers Unite will become a radio program? We can dream.
Well, but, I think the essence of that statement is actually very much, there's a lot of truth to that, because ultimately we are in the content business, we're in the curiosity business, and we want to create well-crafted, well-edited stories that have sort of a visceral, emotional attraction to them. And that's that when we talked about fighting for the share of someone's mind and their attention. How I deliver that to them is becoming more and more relevant with every new technology. And, today we're talking about podcasts, but already we're talking about smart speaker systems. And how is content going to adapt to that, where there's now a different kind of interactivity? And what's going to follow? I don't know. If only I could predict. So I think developing agile teams and a sort of an agile mindset that can quickly pivot to take advantage of different emerging technologies and use cases is sort of key to, I think, thriving in the media world.
What's interesting here is that you're sort of flying the plane and rebuilding it at the same time, which is always a challenge. What have been sort of a one or two things that besides the studio that or beyond the studio that have really sort of resonated or helped you sort of continue to meet the objectives of the organization?
There's so many wonderful things that are going on here. And one that I personally like very much is if you listen to the top of the hour IDs on WNYC, you're going to hear a very different sound than you might have heard previously. At WNYC, the broadcast station here in New York, is we like to think of ourselves as the New York conversation. And part of that is the evolution of radio. What has radio become in the world of Pandora and the ability to stream the BBC from London, and suddenly I have a pocket full of radio stations? What makes us valuable? So there's a lot of rethinking about what that is. Can we be the center of the New York conversation, the conduit by which New Yorkers are able to sort of have shared experiences? And part of that is reflected in these top-of-the-hour IDs, which, if you listen to, don't sound very public radio. What you hear is the voices of people in the streets of New York, the sounds of the city behind them, and the accents and voices of real people in real New York. And I've had people on the street react to that. I've had other radio stations tell us, like, I love what you've done, because we've recharacterized as we begin to reframe what it means to be a local radio station. And we're very, very proud of our newsroom. We'll walk by there. We have a 70-person newsroom. It's one of the largest in New York, winners of many awards, Polk Award, or Morrow Awards. And we're working very hard in creating engagement opportunities around the news. So the news doesn't just go one way anymore. Our communication isn't just from the transmitter to your radio out. What we're doing is actually trying to involve people in the stories and involve them in the station and in the brand in very significant ways. One thing we're doing right now in New York is, as any New Yorker will tell you, the subways are a big old mess, and mass transit's a big mess. And we have an ongoing project called We the Commuters, hashtag We the Commuters. And one of the things we just did is we actually had a listener who volunteered to be the We the Commuters ambassador, who went to the MTA's public hearing yesterday, and representing the listeners of WNYC to read aloud to the management of the MTA what our listeners were, what was important to them about commuting in New York.
What's really interesting to me is that you're, in some sense, reattaching yourself to New York City, the pride that people have in New York City. It's funny, a longtime client of ours is the Empire State Building. And as living here in New York, you sometimes could forget how iconic the building is, but also how important it is to anybody who's ever lived here. And I'll give you a quick example. I mean, sometimes we would just, as a post, we would just say good morning from New York City. And we would get literally thousands of responses. People would say, I love New York. New York's great. Hey, I miss you. I can't wait to get back. And so people are emotionally attached to the city. And New Yorkers, as we know, New Yorkers love and hate New York. They just, and it's like they're feeling it, it's a tough city, and New Yorkers are tough, but they love their town. And so attaching yourself to that and getting closer to the New Yorkers, is pretty brilliant.
Yeah. And we try to be authentic, which is so important, right, in any kind of marketing. And it's not just I'm attaching myself to New York. Fact is, we're WNYC, and we're part of New York, and we've been here for, since the beginning of broadcasting. But, we believe in a lot of the attitudes of New Yorkers are imbued in what we do. We reference often that this is the home of courageous conversations. And when we do something in the green space, our performance space downstairs, we want to have a real and authentic, conversation the way you would in the streets of Brooklyn to two people talking to each other. And that's reflected in our hosts. It's reflected in the kind of news we cover, and sort of the and a little bit of the swagger that we might have. I'll show you some of the ads when we walk around later, and you'll see the ads too kind of have a little bit of a New York attitude. In a way, it's kind of interesting to reflect on them next to the New York Times ads that came out a little bit after ours. And the Truth Campaign is wonderful. And we're both making a stand for the very same values, the importance of journalism to a functioning democracy. We're the only business that's that's in the Constitution, spelled out by name. Journalism is a critical, foundational part of our civic society. But our ads that talk about the same theme have a little more, maybe a little more fun, a little more provocative about them.
Can you give an example? I mean, I know we'll walk around, but give some language of one of the ads.
One of the ads that came out right when the Russia thing was happening, I was actually concerned that by the time the ad hit the streets that it would be over, and it turns out to be the gift that keeps on giving. But, we had one a headline that just said more influential than Russia, and had what looked like Putin, in the ad, and then talked about tuning into Morning Edition for, authentic, non-biased journalism, right? And people were tweeting that and sending it to each other and Instagramming it and saying, wow, one person said, "This is not your father's NPR." And that's exactly right. We can't be your father's NPR. We need to be, New York is a city that's ahead of the trends. New York is more diverse than the rest of the country. And we need to reflect the city that we call home, and we do. And I think everybody else is going to follow us.
Lots and lots of brands, and we've worked with many, need to reinvent. They're doing well, but they always need to be thinking about how is the marketplace changing. I mean, gosh, with millennials and their behavior, cord cutters and so forth. It's certainly a challenging environment to compete. Talk a little bit about, as we wrap up this segment, from one thing that, from a marketing standpoint, that worked that really surprised you.
I've always been a big supporter of qualitative research. And even though I oversee a lot of quant data, it's wonderful to have those moments where you speak to consumers directly and you hear what they're saying about you. And one woman once said to me something along the lines of, "Every interesting conversation I have begins with, 'I heard this on WNYC.'" And in that was a little spark of something that said, you know what? It is about curiosity. And I don't have to reinvent the brand. I just need to amplify the things that are valuable to us. And what we're finding is, and this is surprising, is that we talked before about millennials, that millennials is actually one of the sort of the biggest growing consumers of the work that we create. And despite what people might think, it's actually 25 to 34 is the second largest demographic bucket of listeners to the station, the broadcast station, right? Not even the podcast. The podcasts are younger because, and this is one I often dismiss demographics generally because I think they're often sort of irrelevant. What is important is that this need to be connected with your fellow human beings, to be connected to authentic and journalism and entertainment, knows no bounds. And if you can provide that quality product, the audience is there to get it. So it's surprising and heartening, and that sort of the death of what people might consider old media, I think, is greatly exaggerated.
It's so true, and that's a perfect place for us to take a break. People have been saying at conferences that television is dead and radio is dead and outdoor is dead, and the irony is none of them are even close to it. And from a marketer's perspective, even traditional TV still has a lot of value in terms of its ability to reach broad audiences, and certainly radio has an ability to reach well-defined audiences, which I think is so important. So anyway, when we get back, Peter and I are going to talk about some more really cool stuff. So hang in with us.
You've been listening to another great interview on Renegade Thinkers Unite with Drew Neiser. But the value doesn't end there. As a listener, you can download a free ebook from Drew, Renegade Thinkers, interviews with 11 trailblazing CMOs any business can learn from. Top marketing thought leaders and proven executives from Time Warner, American Express, and Chico's, and others. Get your free copy at renegadethinkersunite.com/ebook. For listeners only at renegadethinkersunite.com/ebook.
Okay, we're back, and my guest is Peter Weingard, CMO of New York Public Radio. And this segment is going to be quick, but we're going to talk about podcasts, because that is certainly a growing area for New York Public Radio, and one that might surprise people unless you start to realize that, oh my God, Radiolab, oh my God, all the shows that you've been doing. But let's talk about, first of all, what makes a great podcast?
I think the thing that makes a great podcast is what makes a lot of great audio experiences, which is we build programs around personalities. And our hosts are often the center of that universe. People want to have a relationship with the host. Audio tends to be very personal. And you have that sort of immediacy, that connection to the person that you're listening to. And it's very important that people have a point of view. For example, you mentioned before, Alec Baldwin. Mm-hmm. The way he approaches an interview is unique to him, and he brings a lot of his personality and experience, and context to the interview. That's unique, right. And it makes, for compelling listening.
I've got some work to do, I guess. It certainly raises the bar, and it does. We are looking for renegade thinking, and one of the things that I think is interesting in the podcasting world. First of all, the numbers and some of the shows that have extraordinary numbers. What's a successful show for you guys in terms of monthly downloads?
Well, I'll say it this way: that we are the second largest podcast studio in the United States. Wow. As measured by PodTrack, we do about 36 million downloads per month. And that's across the entire portfolio.
How many podcasts are we talking about? Series?
That are actively being produced now, we're probably talking about 20.
Wow. So some of them are getting more than 1 million downloads a month.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Wow. Okay. So that's a lot of downloads. And in order to, there are ways to monetize podcasts. One is talk a little bit about dynamic ad insertion and what that really means.
We insert ads into the audio program dynamically at the point of download. So I might hear a different advertisement than you hear, even though we're both in New York and downloading it. It's managed the way digital advertising is managed across the ecosystem. Generally, you have an ad server and it has different amounts of impressions it needs to deliver against different ad goals. Some podcast producers bake it in. The host reads the ad. It's part of the show. We've chosen to do the other thing where we actually have very often host read ads that are dynamically inserted. I think that's the best of both worlds because, otherwise what happens is you go into the back catalog, you listen to an old episode, you're hearing an old ad.
The thing that will surprise you, even with my podcast, this is, in the around 40th episode or so, but if you go and look at my data, my first show and my fifth show still are getting hundreds of listens a month, if not 1,000. And so it amazes me. And if there was an ad in there that we happened to talk about, or we were talking about something that happened in 2016, suddenly the episode is going to feel stale. So having the ability to do dynamic insertions there. And is that the primary way that you all can monetize podcasts, or will people actually pay to subscribe?
Well, we don't charge for subscription. I don't believe that we ever will. So we monetize mostly through sponsorship. Now, we do have listeners who give us money much in the same way that our listeners to the terrestrial broadcast give us money. And that's very much the model of public radio and public media, that we give out the content for free, and people love it so much that they write us a check. You could say that we were the original Kickstarter, right? And we are an original crowdfunding organization. And we imagine we will continue to operate in this manner.
It's funny because that model is not unlike, you're a nonprofit organization, but friends that podcasts that I've been on, they found that they're number one on Overcast, and rather than do advertising, they say, hey, give us $1 a week or something like that. And they found, one, that the fans are more likely to do it. Two, it makes them feel like they're part of the show. So, and then speaking of being part of the show, are there things that you all do that get people more involved in the episodes?
You mentioned Radiolab. If you listen to Radiolab, the credits are always read by one of the listeners who call to and they've been doing that for years and years and years. One more recent one we did is something called Bored and Brilliant, and Manoush Zomorodi has a show called Note to Self, and explores people's struggle with modernity and it's sort of the human look at technology and how it affects our lives. And she'd come across some very interesting research that showed that sort of spacing out is very important to creative thinking, right? And that you can't be inundated with data and screen time, and your brain needs that sort of downtime to process. That's why everybody has the idea while they're shaving, right? And so she had a series of shows that explored this with scientists and a series of experiments that the listeners could participate in. It was done online to help wean themselves off of data overload, information overload, and a series of things to see if their creativity would increase over the period of this experiment. And we had thousands and thousands of people participate in this, and it was it's in fact led to a book. And this September, Manoush is going to be doing a TED Talk, and that will be out. So a lot of exciting things there.
That's a great place to take a break. We'll be right back as we wrap up this amazing episode with Peter Weingard.
Renegade Thinkers Unite is brought to you by Social Media Explorer, the website that explores the world of social media from the inside out. Great advice from today's leading social media columnists and experts at socialmediaexplorer.com. That's socialmediaexplorer.com.
We're back, and my guest today is Peter Weingard, CMO of New York Public Radio, which is a lot more than radio. We're talking about podcasts and so forth. But we're going to step back in this segment, and we're going to focus on what it means to be a CMO and the challenges that CMOs face today. So let's first start with your, this biggest challenge that you've faced and how you've overcome it.
I'm going to start with answering the question about what does it mean to be a CMO now, because I've been thinking about this quite a bit. That in my lifetime, my career lifetime, I've seen a radical departure about what marketing used to mean to what it means today, and I imagine will continue to evolve. Whereas when I started off and I was in advertising, marketing was mostly about marketing communications. So advertising and media planning and communications. And now I would say that's probably the smallest part of the marketing toolkit and maybe the least effective part of the marketing toolkit. And much more of my time is focused on the product, the service, the delivery, the customer, and all the other touch points. So, it almost becomes, I wonder about what the role will mean in the future as marketing tends to take its rightful place at the table of delivering and creating a product to be marketed.
And I think that's so interesting. In my book, one of my favorite CMO interviews was with Terry Funk Graham, who was the CMO at Jack in the Box. And one of the key things to her success was that she got new product development underneath her. And that was so critical because in fast food, everybody knows in their markets knows Jack in the Box, but the way you get attention is with a new product, which you promote, and you need it, almost every 3 months. So you need to look at the marketing, the product, and the marketing opportunity that product creates.
Peter Drucker said the only two functions of a business is innovation and marketing. That's it.
All right. So that's why we need to be renegade thinkers. So being a CMO is hard. You've spent your career, for the most part, once you left DDB, in the media world, for better or for worse, because, man, has it changed. Oh, my God. And so is there something sort of special about being a CMO in the media world?
I said to myself, give me something really hard to do. And I chose this path. Media is a really interesting place to be because it's changed so dramatically and continues to change. So to be, it's like being in a new business all the time because what the business looks like today is not what it looked like a year ago. And a lot of the through line between all the different companies that I've worked for in the media and entertainment space has been around, disruption of the marketplace and trying to develop a new market where one didn't exist. By example, at SFX, which was the precursor to what became Clear Channel Entertainment, which is now known as Live Nation, we were trying to figure out how to sell and market live entertainment in a world where geographic barriers no longer mattered, where you can buy tickets online, where the artists had sort of a different kind of power structure than they had previously. And like, so what does this business look like? And, in that particular case, this is like the era where MTV was very big and powerful. And what did live music mean anymore when it was available all the time? My role before this was working at Scripps Networks, which you may know is a food network, cooking channel, home and garden. And I was working on a startup business around dining reservations.
Right, City Eats.
City Eats, that's right.
Yeah.
And so there, it's quite a renegade approach to a problem, which is they're in the media space, but what are the ancillary businesses where they really belong, because the brand lends itself to that business? A real wholesale rethinking of what it means to be in business. And, just like here, we're not content to sit around and say, because we were a radio station 50 years ago, 40 years, it means that I need to be a radio station today or tomorrow.
The definition, you're not in the automotive, you're in the transportation business. You're not in the radio business. You're in the media and content business.
Remember what business we're in?
Yeah.
We're in the curiosity business.
I love it. And what a great way to talk about your product. Because being a curious person, it's funny when you mentioned the thing about, I heard it on NYC. I do that all the time. And I love consuming information, and I'm curious, but the more interesting it is, the more it sticks in your brain. It just becomes that sticky content that those of us who like cocktail parties love to grab onto. So let's offer, as we sort of wrap up with some sticky content for some CMOs here, a biggest marketing challenge that you've had. I know I've asked this question, but I know. Let's just, you mentioned earlier to me when we were offline that you tried something that didn't work. Talk a little bit about that.
One thing that we tried that didn't work, and I just suspect maybe the timing isn't right, as these things often happen, I'm very curious in how people discover podcasts, and the discovery mechanism isn't mature yet. And we know from research and that, word of mouth is still the number one way people discover. And after that, it's sort of anybody's guess, and they're trying lots of things. So we've been thinking a lot about how to create discovery mechanisms for podcasting. One of the things we tried was, do we want to have a curatorial voice in the format of a newsletter that looks across all the different new podcasts that are coming out and makes recommendations? And although the product was very good, it did not have the consumer uptake that I had hoped. And the reason why, I don't know yet. I think part of it is that people are still learning what podcasts are and how they fit with their lives. And as the industry emerges, I think we're going to see a lot more of that infrastructure, consumer infrastructure that you see in other things. Like someone has to start writing a podcast column in a newspaper. There needs to be a hot list like you have in Billboard charts of the top podcasts.
Well, and that's certainly among my friends who are podcasters. They will say you got to get on other people's shows, which, by the way, I've done quite frequently. And you got to get articles. You got to make it into a top 10 of your niche. And that really helps. So, that's an area of frankly, that, will really help drive your podcast.
Yeah. And that's an area where I think we have been actually writing the book. I could literally say we've written the book on how to launch and market podcasts. A recent example is we partnered with the Museum of Modern Art, the MoMA, to create a podcast called A Piece of Work. And you might say, how are you going to do a podcast on contemporary art when you can't see it? Through the magic of audio, wonderful hosting, and the craft that we have, we got Abby Jacobson from Broad City and guests such as Questlove to tour the museums and get into not just the art, but sort of the things that happen behind the art, the rationale for it, the way it makes you feel, and really a wonderful podcast. But you mentioned the news. If you look at Rolling Stone, there's an article there about it. We got covered in Time all over. People saying best podcast. We've launched at number 2 in the iTunes charts. So having not just the ability to craft a wonderful piece of content, but have the infrastructure and talent to be able to launch it into the consumer market sphere, together is what makes us very exciting and successful.
I think it certainly helps to have a track record, and this is where, a bigger brand and a studio with a reputation, you're going to get it. And this makes it much harder for the little guy just who wants to build an audience. So let's wrap up with 2 do's and a don't for your fellow CMOs out there.
Do obsess over the customer. It's what we're here for. And 2, do be authentic to your brand. The reason why the things that we're doing around WNYC work is because we're really reflecting what people believe our values are. And as soon as we start betraying that trust, it's all over. I would say don't worry quite so much about the technology. It's so integral to everything we do, it almost becomes invisible. And I think most CMOs, like myself, we sit on top of most of the tech infrastructure in a company, the data infrastructure. We're the biggest consumers of data in the company. But having said that, at the end of the day, there's always going to be another new shiny thing around the corner. And we need to be prepared to meet that challenge when it comes to it. But we're still selling the product itself is what's important.
I'm going to attempt to wrap up a really interesting episode, and I think this is one that's nuanced, and I want to probably go back and listen to some of the things that Peter said. But the first thing that I said that noticed was how he talked about his brand and the language that he used. For example, we're in the curiosity business. What a creative way to think about your business. So as you think about your brand, defining your business in the context of your customer and what would stick. And you think about if you're in the curiosity business, you're going to bring people in as employees who are in that business too. And you're going to be your audience. You're going to be either the product delivers that or it doesn't. And we talked a lot about the importance of product. And as a marketer, you can't just take the product that you're given necessarily, particularly in a transformational industry like media. But I would argue we're all in transformational industries, that there are new competition coming up from very large companies that could disintermediate you from your category, whether it's automotive or advertising or media. So this notion of not only being as a curious, they're in the curiosity business, but I would argue that every CMO needs to be in the curiosity business. Add, of course, a little doggedness and of course some imagination. Then you've got sort of a perfect recipe for success. So, Peter, I want to thank you so much for being on the show and all your wisdom.
Thanks for having me, and here's to Renegade thinking.
If you've enjoyed this episode, I have a couple of requests for you. One, go to your favorite platform. It could be Stitcher, Overcast, iTunes. I'm on them all. And subscribe. First of all, subscribe to Renegade Thinkers Unite. Second, feel free to write a review. That would be awesome. And then thirdly, tell your friends. As Peter said, it's really great when you tell your friends about the show. So until next week, keep those Renegade thinking caps on and strong.
This has been Renegade Thinkers Unite, but it doesn't end there. Just go to renegadethinkersunite.com for more and subscribe to the show. That way, you'll never miss an episode. We'll talk with you next time on Renegade Thinkers Unite.